When we think of Sparta, we think of Leonidas and the 300. We think of the impenetrable shields, red cloaks, and men who laughed in the face of death. But the Spartan soldier wasn't born, he was manufactured. He was the product of the most brutal state-sponsored engineering project in human history. This system was called the Agoge. It wasn't just a school. It was a total immersion lifestyle designed to strip away the individual and replace him with a living weapon. From the age of 7 until the age of 30, the Spartan male belonged entirely to the state. Today, we're looking past the Hollywood movies to historical reality. How did a city-state turn frightened children into the most feared warriors of the ancient world? This is the story of the Agoge. The Agoge began before a child could even walk. In Athens, a father decided if a child would be raised. In Sparta, that decision belonged to the government. Plutarch tells us that newborns were taken to a council of elders. They examined the infant for any signs of weakness or deformity. According to some accounts, one test was to drop the baby into a vat of wine and, if it cried, it was considered too weak. If the child was fit, he was assigned a plot of land. If he was puny or misshapen, he was taken to a mountain chasm and left to die. It sounds horrific to modern ears, but to the Spartans, it was logical. Sparta was a military state surrounded by a massive slave population called the Helots. They couldn't afford weaklings. Those who survived the inspection were raised by their mothers and nurses. But even this wasn't a soft childhood. Spartan nurses were famous for not swaddling babies, forcing them to toughen up against the cold, and ignoring their cries. But the clock was ticking. At age 7, childhood ended. At 7 years old, boys were taken from their homes and enrolled in the Agoge, where they were organized into packs and herds, and placed under the supervision of young adult Spartans. They were encouraged to break exclusive ties with their own families, and to consider all Spartans of their father's age to be their parents. Life was intentionally miserable. They walked barefoot to harden their feet. They wore a single cloak winter and summer to harden their skin against the elements. They slept on beds of reeds they had to pull from the river Eurotas with their bare hands. No knives allowed. Plutarch writes, "Of reading and writing, they learned only enough to serve their turn. All the rest of their training was calculated to make them obey commands well, endure hardships, and conquer in battle. Therefore, as they grew in age, their bodily exercise was increased. Their heads were close-clipped, and they were accustomed to going barefoot, and to playing for the most part without clothes. The most defining feature of this stage was hunger. They were deliberately underfed. The goal wasn't to starve them to death, but to force them to steal. If a boy stole food and got away with it, he was praised for his stealth. If he was caught, he was whipped, not for stealing, for being clumsy enough to get caught. This taught them the skills of a scout: silence, awareness, and deception. Plutarch notes, the boys make such a serious matter of their stealing that one of them, as the story goes, who was carrying under his cloak a young fox he had stolen, suffered the animal to tear out his bowels with teeth and claws, and died rather than have his theft detected. And even this story gains credence from what their youths now endure, many of whom I have seen expiring under the lash at the altar of Artemis Orthia. At roughly age 12 or 13, the training shifted from survival to combat. The boys cut their hair short, and the discipline became violent. This brings us to one of the most disturbing rituals of the Agoge, the contest of endurance at the temple of Artemis Orthia. Cheeses were placed on the altar. The boys had to run a gauntlet of older warriors armed with whips to steal the cheese. It sounds like a game, but historical accounts state that the whipping was so severe that boys sometimes died on the altar. They were expected not to cry out or show pain, to flinch was a disgrace. During these teenage years, the social aspect of the Agoge also solidified. This is where the famous pederasty or mentorship system came into play. An older unmarried warrior would choose a younger teenager to mentor. While controversial today in Sparta, this was a transfer of institutional knowledge. The older man was responsible for the boy's conduct. If the boy cried out in pain during training, the mentor was the one who got fined. It created a bond of shared fate that would later hold the phalanx together. Xenophon, who had his sons educated in the Agoge, denied any homoerotic connotations to these relationships, stating, "The relationship of lover and beloved in the Agoge is like that of parent and child, or brother and brother, where carnal appetite is in abeyance. That this, however, which is the fact, should be scarcely credited in some quarters does not surprise me, seeing that in many states the laws do not oppose the desires in question. At this age, Spartan youths were also trained to shun anything that was seen as unnecessary, which even carried over into their speech. Youths were taught to compress their speech to give maximum meaning and power in as few words as possible. The most famous example of this is the tale of Philip II of Macedon, sending the threat, "If I enter Laconia with my army successfully, I will raze Sparta to the ground," to which the Spartans replied, "If." As the trainees approached age 20, the most promising among them were selected for the Crypteia, the secret service. This wasn't military training. This was state-sponsored terrorism. The Spartans were outnumbered by their slaves, the Helots, sometimes by as much as 7-1. The Crypteia was how they kept them in check. Armed only with a dagger, these young men were sent into the countryside. They hid by day and hunted by night. Their mission? To identify and murder any Helot who looked too strong, too smart, or too brave. It served a dual purpose. It culled the leadership of the slave population, and it blooded the young Spartans, desensitizing them to killing before they even stepped onto a battlefield. At age 20, the Spartan was technically a soldier, but the Agoge wasn't truly over. He was voting into a dining mess. If he wasn't voted in by unanimous decision, he became a social pariah, stripped of his rights. If he passed, he spent the next 10 years living in the barracks. Even if he was married, he wouldn't be a free citizen until age 30. To once again quote Plutarch, "The training of the Spartans lasted into the years of full maturity. No man was allowed to live as he pleased, but in their city, as in a military encampment, they always had a prescribed regimen and employment in public service, considering that they belonged entirely to their country and not to themselves, watching over the boys, if no other duty was laid upon them, and either teaching them some useful thing, or learning it themselves from their elders." The Agoge produced the finest soldiers the world had ever seen, but it came at a terrible cost. Sparta produced almost no great philosophers, sculptors, or playwrights. They poured all their genius into war, and left nothing else behind. They sacrificed their childhoods, their individuality, and their humanity to become the shield of Greece. And for a few centuries, it worked. I'm Barbarian Herodotus. For more on this topic, I recommend Paul Cartledge's book, The Spartans. Subscribe for more history, theology, and masculine virtue.